lost the internet. Hello, we're about to start our fall puppet forum, Puppets and the Immaterial World, in 5 minutes. And until then, we're going to go numb. No, silent. Okay. Great. Is it 8 o'clock? 7 o'clock? Exactly. Good. So greetings to the audience here in person. Very exciting to see you. And also to the audience online via the Facebooks for our Yukon Fall Puppet Forum, Puppets, and the Immaterial World, with Claudia Orenstein to my left and Tim Cusack on the far left. Welcome, Claudia and Tim. Thank you for being here. Yay. All the way from New York via the railroad system. I wanted to start off with our housekeeping information. We're joined here this evening by Emily Wicks, our Manager of Operations and Collections, who's doing the Facebook Live, and Saul Ramirez, our undergraduate Waring Fellow, right here. We wanted to let you know the exits are to your left, behind you, and the best exit is the one behind you to your right, going out the way you came in through the museum. The bookstore is closed, so if you go out that back exit behind the movable wall, then the alarms go off and the police come, or the fire department. So those are the exits there. And the restrooms are behind you and to your left. So that's information we wanted to share. We wanted to let you know about other events happening at the Ballard Institute right now. It's been a very busy fall, very exciting. So ongoing through December 15th is the Wonderland Puppet Theater in the Beloved Community, curated by Dr. Paulette Richards, which you passed through on the way in, and it's about a biracial puppet theater that started in the mid-60s in an integrated suburban housing development called Concord Park. Alice Swan and Nancy Schmalley created this puppet theater, and our curator, Dr. Paulette Richards' perspective is about the way this work connects with Dr. Martin Luther King's vision of the beloved community and ideas of racial equity and justice. All the issues about housing, fair housing, civil rights movement, the women's movement in the 60s and afterwards, and the development of media for children, children's television, kind of around the time or before the time that Jim Henson got going in that area. So that exhibit's happening on up through December 15th. We wanted to mention that our next fall puppet performance is Justin Lander of Modern Times Theater performing the Baffle Box show. That will be on Saturday, October 19th. 2 shows at 11 a.m. and 2 p.m. And Justin is part of Modern Times Theater, a really dynamic theater company from East Hardwick, Vermont. Very skillful hand puppetry for those in the puppet world, puppet students who want to see some brilliant hand puppetry, and a kind of goofy, surrealistic show. Then you can get this on the way out. On November 2nd, Emily Schubert's going to perform a cornucopia cabaret, Saturday the 2nd. And on December 7th, Charlotte Lily Gaspard is performing The Dragon's Laugh and Other Tales. So that's our fall puppet performance series. Also on, I thought I had the thing right here. Yes. On October 25th and 26th, we're doing a symposium about the Wonderland Puppet Theater. This, again, put together by Dr. Paulette Richards. It's an in-person and virtual symposium with panelists exploring segregation, the civil rights movement, women's liberation, 1960s puppet theater, and children's media. And it'll be a variety of UConn faculty from different departments in the university, and scholars and activists and puppeteers from beyond, excuse me, especially from the Philadelphia area where the Wonderland Puppet Theater originated. So that's free. Check that out. Registration required. I don't know if we have flyers for this out front yet, but no worries. And then on Saturday, October 26th, we're taking part in the Downtown Boo Bash, which is a Halloween event where kids come and trick-or-treat, and adults do that too, so you can dress up and honor the object performance-friendly holiday of Halloween. The next puppet forum will be Wednesday, November 20th, Exploring Puppetry in the Old Man and the Old Moon, which is a play that's going to be produced by CRT. They're rehearsing right now. A number of puppet arts folks and the director, Matt Sorensen, are not here because they're rehearsing. But we're going to do a forum about the way that puppets were designed, created, integrated into that show, The Old Man and the Old Moon. So that's a lot of what we're doing this fall. So, one thing we wanted to do was to ask you to fill out this mailing list, or so we can affirm that people actually. Thank you, Emily. That people actually came to this event in person, and we do have we do send unobtrusive emails about our many exciting events. This evening, our fall puppet forum series is Puppets in the Immaterial World, as we were saying earlier, and with Claudia and Tim about spirituality or the spirit and puppets, and sometimes that seems kind of unusual, but we're celebrating the publication of the second volume of Puppet and Spirit. And with this, the book actually hasn't appeared in bookstores yet.
Or even in our homes.
Or even in your homes. But it will, and you can order it. I think does this give you a discount?
Yeah, there's a discount code.
There's a discount code. So if you would like to order this book, you can take one of these, right? There's some back there. Buy the cookies, and then you can order that book. So look, we're already going. Oh no, you're just passing out the. I thought you were running to get a cookie, but no. Okay. Okay. So, Dr. Claudia Orenstein is a professor of theater and performance at Hunter College and the CUNY Graduate Center in New York, and has spent almost 2 decades writing on contemporary and traditional puppetry in the U.S. and Asia. Yay. One of her recent books is Reading the Puppet Stage, Reflections on Dramaturgy and Performing Objects. And she co-edited with Tim the 2 volumes of Puppet and Spirit, Ritual, Religion, and Performing Objects. She's also the editor of the online peer-reviewed journal Puppetry International Research, which is this new effort, very exciting to do, to up the game with scholarly puppetry studies. So, thank you very much, Claudia. Also, Claudia and Dacia Posner and I co-edited the Rutledge Companion to Puppetry and Material Performance. So I've been lucky enough to work with Claudia in a variety of different ways, and it's always exciting. Tim was the assistant editor for both the Rutledge Companion to Puppetry and Material Performance, which is, I guess, how I first got to know Tim, and also Women and Puppetry, which is a volume that the puppeteers here should make sure to look at. Excuse me. And Tim, as we mentioned, has co-edited both volumes of Puppet and Spirit. He's particularly interested in the intersections of queer culture, theater, and spiritual beliefs. He's an adjunct lecturer at the theater department at Hunter College, where he teaches acting. So welcome to you both. We're so excited that you're here. We want to discuss Puppet and Spirit, Ritual, Religion, and Performing Objects, which is Volume 2, but I think also you're going to talk about Volume 1. We didn't have a separate puppet form for Volume 1. Volume 1 came out last year, I think, and that was subtitled Sacred Roots, Material Entities, Consecrating Acts, Priestly Puppeteers, and Volume 2 is subtitled Contemporary Branchings, Secular Benedictions, Activated Energies, Uncanny Faiths. And I think it's looking more at recent aspects of puppetry that have to do with spirituality. And there are a lot of Yukon connections here, including right in the room here. Volume 1 included an essay by our puppet arts colleague, Dr. Matthew Cohen, who's sitting in the back row, and Volume 2 about Javanese puppet theater. And Volume 2 includes essays. Yes, I'm getting there. Thank you. And Volume 2 includes essays by both Dr. Jungmin Song, sitting next to Matthew, titled Consoling the Dead, Sim U Song's Puppet Rituals for Modern Korea, an essay discussion by Rahul Kunathara and Sangeet, I'm not pronouncing it. Okay. Entitled Exploring Spirituality in Topavakutu Shadow Puppetry of Kerala, which is the form of puppetry that Rahul is deeply connected to. And then I had my own essay to The Thing You Can't See, Bread and Puppet Approaches Spirituality. So I appreciate the way that all of these Yukon folks have been connected to this volume. So I'm fascinated by this. I know you have a very exciting talk planned. I was just thinking about spirituality. So I looked up in the authoritative source, Wikipedia, and they talk about spirituality in two ways. Traditionally, spirituality referred to a religious process of reformation which aims to recover the original shape of man, that's interesting, oriented at the image of God as exemplified by the founders and sacred texts of the religions of the world. Okay, I guess we won't explore that too much. And then it goes on to say, modern usages tend to refer to a subjective experience of a sacred dimension and the deepest values and meanings by which people live, often in a context separate from organized religious institutions. I guess that's the modern aspect of it. This may involve belief in a supernatural realm beyond the ordinarily observable world, personal growth, a quest for the ultimate or sacred meaning, religious experience, or an encounter with one's own inner dimension. And I was thinking that I was noting that in her foreword to Volume 2, Terry Silvio, who also a very interesting puppet scholar writing about puppetry, she writes, puppetry's aura of the sacred, its refusal to separate the spiritual from the material, is not a holdover from the past, which we often think of it in that way, but a reaction to the present, a strategy for staying ungovernable that is constantly renewed. When we want to turn this over to you both, because I know you've been thinking a lot about how to have this discussion, and I'm sure we're going to talk about what is spirit and why it's connected to puppetry. So maybe we'll just do that right now and turn it over to you if that's okay. And then later on we'll invite you to join in conversation with your questions and comments. And there's tea and juice and cookies, of course, still. So I don't know who wants to speak first. Claudia and Tim, welcome and thank you. Yes, the PowerPoint presentation, of course. That'll be.
That would help.
That's going to help a lot.
Yeah, there we go. Look
Yes.
at that. Wow.
Oh. So what we want to do is kind of introduce you to these two books, and what their content is is in some ways a kind of response to those questions and issues, and then discuss them more and think about how people offered things to these books in terms of those ideas. Our first question is why these books now? These are the two books, by the way. Although one of them, the first one, really focuses more on established traditions and established religious contexts. Although even in that book we have puppeteers and forms that are discussed that are maybe not, are maybe aside from the sort of mainstream or the doctrinal aspects of a religion. But these are more established forms, but they're all living traditions. So there's really, it's not like one is history and one is present. They're both present, but in different ways. The second one is more about interest that you're sort of talking about, that second definition of contemporary puppeteers and their interest in exploring, connecting with spirituality. There's a lot of things we want to say. I'm going to we sort of organize them in an order, so I'll get back to some of these ideas. One of the things we are responding to is all the expansion of puppetry and the expansion of already literature, these different co-edited books that we've been talking about, and exploring puppetry in a lot of different ways. And so anthropology, if you look in anthropological texts and things, there's a lot about puppetry and spirit. There's all these ritual practices, but they're maybe not always connected together or so often they're talked about within their specific traditions, but what does it mean to kind of talk across traditions? And what does it reveal? I mean, in my own kind of path, I was looking I suddenly realized one day that a lot of the puppetry that I'm writing about and interested in is in ritual contexts. And then I sort of thought like, oh, is the ritual puppet, is that a thing, the ritual puppet, and what is that? There are all these wonderful people who've been writing about it, and some of them, I guess pretty much all of them, appear somewhere. We have a wonderful foreword by Jane Marie Law for the first book, which is very moving. But so trying to find not, a kind of conversation about this by presenting and exploring all of these different traditions, and also I think putting them together in a place where especially people who are interested in puppetry can find them and get exposed to a lot of these different traditions. Also, there's really a response to new materialism, this discussion of object-oriented ontologies that is talking about objects having their own agency. There's a lot of discussion about that in scholarship right now and in theater scholarship. And often there's a lot of theater books about this that aren't actually about puppets. They're about other kinds of objects and materiality. And we wanted to bring that awareness also to puppetry. But even somebody like Jane Bennett in her Vibrant Matter, she's interested in the vibrancy and the agency of matter, but makes a very strong point of dissociating it from anything divine or spiritual or any other kind of an actor. So what is it that's going on in some of these ritual forms where there's materiality and there's some kind of immaterial presence and a human being? There's this sort of triangle of actors, and how can we create or think about expanded assemblages? She talks about assemblages of objects and humans, but are there expanded assemblages? Is there something else going on? And can we open that up as a category of discussion?
Before you change, could you explain that image?
Oh, I'm sorry.
This image.
So this is an image. You're gonna have to tell me. This is from Eric N's. This is Susan Simpson's artwork. In Eric N's. And are you going to talk about that later?
No, because I'm going to talk more about the Machine of St. Rose.
Okay. But in the second book volume, we have a wonderful article by Eric N that Tim's going to talk to you about, and part of that is his conversation with artist Susan Simpson and her work, and this is something from her work.
And just one thing to point out about this is you'll see there's kind of the basic human form, and then what she does is that's kind of the base of this performing object, and then what she does is she adds these colorful things to it that then change what that figure represents. So it's sort of her way of representing the infinite malleability of queerness and queer identity.
And Susan is originally from Vermont and teaches, I think, still at California Institute of the Arts, CalArts, where Janie Geiser also teaches, and she and Janie have this theater, Automata, in Los Angeles, which supports a lot of puppet and object performance.
Yeah. So this is also to kind of show that, even the stuff that we're talking about, some of it is very figurative in terms of looking like human shape. Some of it is something like this where there's human shape but other kinds of materiality. And some of it has no human shapes. I keep doing that. And, there's a great growth of puppetry just in general. And, Broadway, you're familiar with this wonderful work of Yukon artists, experimental theater. And in something, for instance, like The Lion King, there is interest in spiritual ideas, in characters like Rafiki who have magic. So the puppet kind of keeps standing in and being a place for magic and spirit and things that are coming in from somewhere else. How can that all be part of a conversation where we actually acknowledge this? I think I actually was going to say it later, but I'll just say it right now, which is part of the goal of these books is to really create this as an area of discussion. This is really a topic within puppetry that people talk about. Puppeteers, I think, have a sense of the magicness of their figures, or this whole idea of animism and things coming to life. But what is that discussion? Can we engage in that in a deeper way, cross-culturally, and thinking about contemporary artists and traditions, and make that really a kind of visible area of discussion? Sometimes in academia, people don't really want to talk about spirituality because it's not, fact-based and part of a kind of accepted critical discourse. But so how do we talk about that? How do we think about it, where are examples?
Great, so I'll jump in here. The other thing, just with The Lion King, I think it bears mentioning that a lot of the puppets that Julie Taymor put into that show were actually inspired by ritual objects in particularly West Africa. And so I think it's important, I just think it's important to point out that there's these things that have been adapted, co-opted, one might say colonized by the commercial theater, but they originally held very important ritual functions in whatever culture they're coming out of. And now they've been put on stage as these commercial things. I think it's kind of worth thinking about that. So that was kind of the puppet side of this book. The other side of the title is spirit. And so not only, are we responding to this very exciting moment that's happening in theater, where it's kind of now becoming a running gag in New York theater. You can't go to a show anymore without a puppet, right? And we think it's great. There's some of my friends who aren't so into the puppets. So that's part of what we're responding to, but we're also responding to this whole spiritual side of things, right? And the artists both artists in both books, right? So the folks in the first book who are dealing with more traditional forms, they're in a situation where they're now in this postmodern, post-capitalist world that we're living in, and they're trying to keep these forms that are very old alive. So that's one side of the equation. But on the other side of the equation are the artists that we're looking at in the second book, and they're contemporary artists, and they are navigating these political, social, cultural frames that we're all navigating, right? And they're making work that's in response to it. So we're in this very unprecedented spiritual moment. If you look at the literature around religious studies, people are moving away from organized religion. And yet, at the same time, the more traditional religions are becoming, perhaps one could argue, more conservative, right? So the people who aren't leaving, say, traditional Christianity, that version of Christianity is becoming more of an evangelical, fundamentalist, conservative Catholic version, right? That's one argument that's being made. The other thing that we're seeing, and we're all very aware of this just in this country, is that a lot of these very conservative religious movements are also allied with very conservative political figures. And obviously here we have the spectacle of Donald Trump and Christian nationalism. But you see this in a lot of countries, right? Putin has aligned himself with very conservative strands of Russian orthodoxy. Of course, you see this in Iran. Even someone like Xi has aligned himself with very conservative Confucian values. So it's playing itself out in many different ways across the globe politically, right? So that's another moment that these artists are navigating. But then what's really interesting is that our understanding of physics, right? Our understanding of what the universe actually is has in some ways kind of brought us back around to this almost animist understanding of the nature of reality. And I know John talked about this. I mean, I was very influenced by John's chapter, not even just in this book, but in the Rutledge Companion, where you're kind of looking at we're in this post-Enlightenment, postmodernist period, and suddenly you're dealing with something like quantum physics, and you're dealing with philosophies that sound a lot like Buddhism or Hinduism, right? That there's this void. There's just this void, and things emerge. Material reality, material phenomenology emerges out of this void, right? And you see a lot of folks on the more of the New Age spectrum of religious belief talking about quantum spirituality, right? And if you go on to YouTube videos with a lot of these folks, it's quantum field this, quantum field that. There's all this stuff about quantum physics. So we've kind of come. It's interesting. Our science has now brought us back around, along with that, I'm assuming for folks have heard this name, the Max Weber, the very famous German sociologist. 1918, he gives this talk in Munich, and he introduces this idea of the disenchantment of the world, and that things are we're getting more rational. The world used to be this magical place. and everything was connected, and if you were able to tap into those connections, you too could do magic, right? And that's kind of the image of the model of the shaman. And then the shaman became organized religion, and if we sort of shifted more into a dogmatic understanding of spirituality. There now were religious leaders, there were religious structures, there were religious texts, and then that in turn led to capitalism, and now we're getting even further away from spirituality. And so what Weber was describing was that this process that humankind has become less and less and less tapped into the magic of the world that Claudia was talking about earlier. But what you now see in religious scholarship is this idea of the re-enchantment of the world. That didn't happen. That we didn't lose our religious beliefs. We didn't lose our spiritual beliefs. That actually, in a lot of ways, we've kind of come back around. And we're seeing this reassertion of this idea that the world is this magical, mystical, spiritual place, right? So, spirituality, religion, right? We kind of think of them as one thing, but actually religious scholars separate them out. So, the word spiritual comes from spiritus, which is breath in Latin, right? So there we go. There's the connection right there, right? And you'll see in puppetry scholarship a lot of this idea about keeping the puppet alive, right? The illusion of breath, the illusion of life in the puppet. And so this idea of that spirituality is the breath, and that you also see it in a lot of cultures. Prana is breath, chi is breath, right? This idea that this animating force that is what's enabling me to talk to you right now and gesticulate and be present and conscious is also connected to this idea of these higher discarnate realms. In religious studies, religious scholars talk about dogma and they talk about cultus. And dogma is like, that's what's written down, right? That's the text. Learn it, learn the rules, study the rules, don't sin, don't do anything bad, it's all here for you, right? So that's dogma. But religious scholars also talk about this idea of cultus. And I think for the purposes of this book, cultus is a really helpful idea, right? Because that's the music, that's the incense, that's the beautiful pictures painted on whatever the religious structure is, right? It's all of the sensual stuff that makes going to religious services a sensual, enjoyable experience, right? And then the only other thing I want to say about spirituality versus religion is that, it's all rooted in shamanism, right? And, we talk a lot about that puppets started, you could go back into the roots of puppeteers, it's rooted in shamanism. So there's a lot of overlap around these ideas. I have this little chart. This is the Pew research from last year. Interesting thing that we're seeing in the data, 41% of folks say they're becoming more spiritual. But 33% of folks say they're becoming less religious. And so obviously there's just curiosity in here. Who in here actually considers yourself like a member of a religious faith? Like you go to church, you consider yourself a member of religion. Okay, interesting. How many folks consider yourself spiritual? You have some kind of spiritual practice. Yeah, I would put myself in that. Yeah, I would put myself in that, right? So they're not necessarily the same thing. Again, from Pew, just one thing I thought this was very interesting. If you look at the third bar from the top, that's evangelical. 47% of evangelicals said that religion's become more important to them, right? But among U.S. adults overall, it's only 24%. So for folks who are already evangelical, they're twice as likely as other Americans to say that religion has become more important in their life over the past year. And then finally, the last thing I just want to touch upon around spirituality is, this is sociologist Herbert Knobloch's definition of spirituality. And I think this is really compelling because I think that it also describes what an artist does, right? So, Herbert Knobloch defines spirituality as the ability to express one's emotions, thoughts, and feelings in a way that is consistent with the truth, you're working from your own personal experience, right? You aren't necessarily adhering to an organized religion and what they're saying, right? You may be adjacent to it, maybe you're playing around with the ideas, but you're kind of doing your own thing. You're open to the cultural experiences of other people. There's no distinction between clarity and laity. If you can do it, you can do it. And finally, ultimately, it's subjective. How successful it is, whether it worked or not, is ultimately up to you, not any other authority. And so I think that while these are his 5 characteristics of a spiritual person, I think these are also the characteristics of an artist.
And these images, if you're interested, are we're going to talk about this one in a little while in relationship to Min's paper. And this, I'll also mention, this is hula ki'i, which is a Hawaiian form of performance, dance of the sacred image. So we'll get to some of these. So while there's all these new kinds of spirituality and contemporary puppeteers involved in this, we also have this long history, as we've said, of ritual practices that use puppets. These are living traditions continuing today. We also have, I think, this passion of puppeteers for this topic. I mentioned it a little bit, but I also noticed when I was giving talks about some ritual puppets that I've been studying, people would come up to me like, oh, that's so interesting, I want to know more, and where do I find out about this? And so there's this real, I think, hunger for an interest in this topic from puppeteers. And as I said before, there hasn't really been a fully recognized and articulated discussion about it. So putting these together and allowing us to learn more about living traditions and how they speak to our current moment, along with what contemporary puppeteers are dealing with, I think is sort of what we're going through. So we put out a call for papers, and we cast a very wide net. We said puppet and spirit, and our original title was, I had actually found it, let me see if I can, was something like, now I don't have it. Investigations in material performance and bodiless presence. So it was less ritual and religion. It was very open, and we had an overwhelming response. We had so many people respond, and in ways that I didn't expect. Like, I was sort of thinking about, to be honest, I was thinking about the first book, which was more like traditional performance context. And so many people who were responding about their own work or work they had seen that they wanted to talk about, some almost very confessional. And we realized there was this much broader conversation, and we wanted to find place for all of these wonderful things. So instead of cutting things out, we ended up doing 2 books, which was a lot of work. But we trying to juxtapose them and connect these 2 books. We could have divided them up in other kinds of themes and ways, but so it was kind of easy to say one more traditional forms and one more contemporary. And so as we talk about the book now, we're going to look at more in the content. We're going to go back and forth. So we're going to talk about each section. There are 5 sections in each book. And we're going to give you like a little bit more about one particular article in that section, and then a kind of shout out to some of the others. And then we'll go back and forth. So you'll see hopefully how the 2 books kind of interconnect, and all of these topics kind of talk with each other.
Very exciting.
Okay, just what you have here is some other things that we're not going to actually talk about too much, but this is from my article on Nangyai, or Thai puppets, and over here is Ana Martinez's very beautiful, moving article in the second book about performers talking about people who are coming in to the U.S. from Mexico on the border, and deaths on the border, and retracing those and the roles that objects have in that. Very beautiful piece. So we start with volume 1. So Tim's already talked about like kind of the roots of religion and shamanism, this idea of spirits becoming manifest either through a person or an object that takes on some kind of life. So the first the first section of book 1 is about shamanic lineages. And it starts with this lovely article by Laurel Kendall, who's an anthropologist who has focused a great deal of her life on writing about Korean shamans. And it's nice in this article, she actually starts with the anecdote of us having met at an event that was going on in New York, which was a kind of staged performance of a shamanic ritual. And I ran into her and I was thinking about this book, and I was like, they were doing a kind of a ritual with these paper-shaped figures, where somebody is trying to, they took people from the audience and said, we're gonna, do you have somebody who died in your life that you want to set their soul free? And doing this ritual with these paper-shaped figures, and kind of whether they moved and the soul got set free, or whether they were not set free. And afterwards, I kind of, as we were talking, and I said, I'm doing this book. I'd love to know more. I mean, this is also, this book is just for me because I'm so interested in this stuff. Like, I'd love to know more about what shamans, do in Korea with, don't they use puppets? Don't they have? So would you write something? So she wrote this really wonderful essay, which is about looking at all the different kinds of objects that Korean shamans use, a very particular kind of shamans called the mansin, and the different sorts of roles they have. So some are more just like props, and she describes a lot of different rituals she's been to over the years, but some take on a different kind of embodiment. So the one you see, the person lying down here, for example, this is a doll figure, and this is a ritual for someone who was ill and also had a kind of madness. And the doll figure was supposed to, there were all kinds of exorcistic actions that go on, and then the doll figure is supposed to take away all that illness, and then gets taken out and burned or buried, and supposed to relieve the patient. So they have that kind of role. But the larger photograph here is of the descending of the house lord. The Lord, a house soul. If the spirit of the house has disappeared, there's a kind of ritual, and the people who are from the house will be holding these branches, and then the branch will kind of start to come to life, and sometimes it pulls them and takes them out, of the house, or other kinds of things happen with it. So it becomes kind of embodied. She also talked about sometimes the shamans actually doing weddings for people who had passed away without being able to be married, and so they do a wedding for them and have doll figures who represent and actually go through the action, so it's a more performative thing. Another interesting example is something that she said she saw only once, where there were two outfits of a boy and a girl that were just the clothing, and the Munson sort of picked them up and made them look like characters. So there's a whole range of kind of performative activities that these shamans do, and she does a really interesting job of trying to sort of talk about them and relate, like, what is more like puppetry, or how do we define puppetry, and think about all these different objects in relationship to that.
Right, so then we paired that chapter with Min's chapter on Simusong. Min, if I mispronounce anything, please just jump in and correct me, okay?
Sure.
Thank you. And so this is Sim was a contemporary Korean avant-garde folklorist, performer, director, artistic director, and he was really key in bringing back a lot of these traditional Korean performance forms. And he was particularly interested in the mansin, but by the 70s and the 80s, it was actually illegal to do these kind of shamanic performances in Korea. Min, when did it stop? When did it stop being illegal, or when it?
It's never been illegal, but I think they couldn't do it within the Seoul, that is the capital. So
Okay.
they were kind of pushed out from the central Seoul.
Okay.
That's what happened.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
It happened, and then but it was stopped by the authorities.
Right.
Because the laws were
Right.
Yeah.
So he would actually, sponsor performances by these women, and the authorities would try to close them down, and he would say, no, this is cultural heritage, this is, and it was a way that he was able to keep the tradition going. He took, it's pronounced kut, right? I'm pronouncing that correctly? Yeah, kut, yeah. So kut is K-U-T, and kut is the actual ceremony that the Munsons do to heal somebody who's sick, to help a soul pass on to the next side, bless a marriage, whatever the function of the ritual is. And he took this idea of kut and he applied it to the modern political situation, though, in Korea. And so he saw these rituals as a way to bring healing to the divided Korean peninsula. And he was particularly fixated on the reunification of North and South Korea. He was part of, he was very active in the Minjung cultural movement, which was a workers' cultural movement. And they were very anti-colonialist, they were anti-Western capitalism, they were pro-unification. And so it's a very interesting example of taking this, very ancient Korean indigenous folkloric form and applying it to contemporary political discourse.
So here's our little shout out, just so you get a little more sense of everything that's in these books, because they're very rich. So I'm just going to shout out to the Hula Ki'i, the dance of the sacred image. It's an interview, and we have a couple of interviews in the book between Auli'i Mitchell, who is a practitioner, researcher, teacher of this form, who has kind of revived it, and talking with his student, Napali Souza, is interviewing him, and he talks about this form that was really deliberately, erased, and his process of reviving it and what that's about. So you can look at that. That's one of the characters.
If we actually go back to one, just go back to the next, go back one more slide, Claudia, thank you. Sorry, so I meant to mention, so this is Sim, and these are the, again, is it Nokjon? Is that not? Yeah, Nokjon. So the Nokjon, these are the paper puppets that Claudia is referring to, except in this case, he's actually literally made them into figures. So in this case, they really do look like puppets, right? Okay, let's move forward.
Oops, I went backwards. Sorry.
Yeah, there we go.
Wait.
Yeah, great. So then in the second book, we've got two other chapters that are very interesting. One is by Hazel Rickard, called Spiritualist Material Performance, Whiteness and the Animist Other. And this is a photograph of Jonathan Koons. He was an Ohio spiritualist, meaning he would go to his house and you could talk to the ghosts. And he had a table that performed. But he also dug up indigenous remains from his property and displayed them on his mantle, and supposedly spoke through Indian guides when he did his seances, and that's kind of what Hazel is talking about in this chapter, the problematic racial content of these spiritual performances. And then Paulette Richards, who curated the exhibit that's currently up here, has a wonderful chapter called Worth Her Salt, Zombification in Liberation Theology in a Puppet Film. Very relevant right now, given what's happening in Springfield, Ohio, as she talks a lot about the trope of the zombie in American popular culture and voodoo, and how voodoo, which is Haitian syncretic religion of Catholicism and West African religion, how that has been represented in American culture. And I think we're seeing, unfortunately, the fruits of that in what's happening in Ohio.
So section 2, we moved on, so we've got shamans. I thought another important thing that ritual does is create sense of community through communal celebrations. So one of the chapters in that section in the first book is Japanese karakuri ningyo and the performance of Shinto. So this is by Yasuka Senda and William Condi. And it's about these big festivals that happen in Japan, where there are these huge carts called dashi, that have on them, so there are all kinds in Japan, all these festivals and all kinds of these cards, but there's a whole tradition also of ones that have these these puppets on top that are transforming. They do tricks like this one here that you see. So those are the big dashi, and then the smaller photo shows you a kind of a puppet where there are two, I don't know if you can see on his shoulders, there are two acrobats, and so they do acrobatics and the big Chinese puppet character who's in the middle is like smiling at them during these performances. So this is part of a big ritual festival where there's one of these dashi doesn't have these puppets, but has the spirit of the kami, or the god, and it's taken through the town. But what's really important that they describe is just the community of the people who have to push these carts through the town. In one example that she gives, they have to push them through shallow water, because traditionally these two places that from where the carts are stored to where the performance happens and the event happens you can only get there by going through the water. But they keep doing that because it's the effort that the community pulls together in pushing these carts that have performers in them, they have musicians in them, they have the puppets in them. The puppets are done by, there are strings, and inside are all the puppeteers hidden below. So often in Japanese puppetry we see the puppeteers. In this one they're hidden, and so there's a kind of more magical quality to these puppets. They do these extraordinary tricks. So the community has to get together to pull these enormous things to where they're going, or through these towns, around these small streets. And that kind of communal effort is part of a sort of sense of worship, of giving yourself to that spirit, to the gods, to the sense of community. So this is really places an example of puppetry that is within a communal festival as part of bringing this sense of community together.
Yeah, and so the equivalent in the second book, which in that section is called Communitas Reclaimed, is the article that we mentioned earlier by Eric N., Queer Puppet Saints, Nested Intuitions. Now, his essay is really of this meditation on queerness in puppetry, and that's actually not what I'm going to choose to focus on right now, because like in Japan, he talks about the machine of St. Rose of Viterbo. And as the image is pixelated, unfortunately, but you can see how tall it is. And it happens the first week in September is the Feast of St. Rose in Italy. And 100 men from the town of Viterbo, they literally carry this thing. You can see them in the picture there. They're literally carrying it on their back, again, as an act of religious devotion to the saint. But it's so dangerous that they give all of them the last rites before the procession, because somebody could theoretically get killed doing this.
So my little shout out is to Matthew. I wanted you to know, I didn't know you'd tell him that he's got a wonderful chapter in book 1, Wang Ritual of Shiraban, is that right? Continuance of a cratophonic tradition. And a tradition that deals with material objects, but connects us to the spirit. So catch him to hear more about that in our conversation later.
And then in Communitas Reclaimed in the second book, as we mentioned previously, John has a wonderful essay about Peter Schumann's appropriation of Catholic iconography and medieval liturgical forms in Bread and Puppet, the thing you can't see, Bread and Puppet approaches to spirituality. And then I just want to say something about this image. This is George Karnoff's memorial. This is in the Grove of Remembrance at Bread and Puppet. And I was actually at the New York Independent Theater Awards last month, and we gave Teresa Linehan from the Czechoslovak American Theater the Distinguished Achievement Award. And I was telling her about the book, and I'm talking to her about John's chapter, and she's like, wait a minute. And we realized that this was her late partner's memorial, and she'd helped build this and design it. So it was kind of this amazing little magical moment of spirituality with the book. And then the other essay in that section that's really worth checking out is talking about Lunch with Sonia, a ritual for departing by Loco 7 Dance Puppet Theater Company, which was an interview piece between Denise Graber, who's the artistic director of the La Mama Puppet Festival, and her life partner and artistic partner, Federico Restrepo. His really beautiful piece about his Aunt Sonia when she committed assisted suicide about 12 years ago.
I wanted to mention that the memorial for George Karnoff is in the form of a hand puppet booth, because he was a big Punch and Judy performer. So this was, and actually they left a doctor's bag of Punch and Judy puppets at the foot of it, so anybody could perform that.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. So section 3 is called Powerful Players. It came out of, I mean, we had a couple of, what the articles that we had, but also like my questions. One of my article in the book is about the matter that matters. Like, why are even some puppet traditions where all the puppets kind of have, like doing puppetry has a ritual, spiritual idea behind it, but then there are some puppets that are super powerful, or why are some puppets more powerful than others? What makes them that? How do we think about that? So this wonderful article by Robin Riesendahl, Consecrated Puppets, the Puppet Deities of Southern China and Taiwan, and he talks about these particular puppets in Fujian province and in Taiwan that are special kind of ritual puppets. Now, some are done by puppeteers who are, who consider themselves puppeteers, but they also have these ritual puppets. And some of these ritual puppeteers do specifically rituals with these puppets. And there are 3 in particular. Chief Marshal Tian, who's a patron saint of both the puppet theater and opera companies, and so all of the companies have one. But some of them use them more, and they, usually perform before a show. But he's also a protector of children, and it's interesting because there's a curious story about him having been miraculously conceived when his mother chewed a kernel of rice in a field, and then because she got pregnant and she was unwed, she left him there, and he was kind of taken up by crabs who fed him and supported him. And then she went back to get him, but he couldn't speak, but he played beautiful music and danced, and so he went to the court to do dance and music. But the fact that he couldn't speak, which is really interesting, the puppet has a mouth that's cut to move, but the string is unattached. He's got a string hanging down. And he's supposed to be a protector of children. There's Zhong Hui, the demon slayer, who has another interesting story. And here is a picture. So here we have Marshall, I think that's Marshall Chen, right?
Yeah, it is.
And then this one is Lin Jinlian, who's a performer who has really done a lot with these rituals and expanded some of them and makes them in. So there's a real mix of the entertainment and the ritual aspects to what he does, but he's really performs a lot as a ritual performer. And then there's the Lady of Lin Shui, who is puppets. She induces rain, cures children of measles, has a lot of different things. So these are puppets used for particular rituals. And Robin in this section also gives us very detailed information about the rituals that the puppets do and how the process of those. Also about what's called the opening of the eyes, which is a kind of ritual to bring the spirit into the puppet by painting the eyes, which is you find in a lot of Asian traditions. And there are, for some of these puppets, there are special things that are built, like powerful writings that are put inside the puppet to give it its power. So what makes the puppet powerful? These rituals, these objects inside them, and then how they're used.
And that in the picture of Tian, the way he's hung, you notice he's hung. That's a demon on your left, and that's a child on your right. So he's hung backstage between the two characters that represents that he's protecting the child from the demon. So just wanted to point that out. So then in the section in the second volume, we call this Faith and Secular Performance. So this is where the two books are actually going to start to diverge a little bit. Like the first two sections, they kind of track each other pretty closely, and then as we go along, they start to diverge, and this is where they start to diverge. But I thought that this was a nice companion to Robin's chapter, because this is Kati Adrianov's chapter, Children, Birds, Flowers, a minor musical performance as prayer. So it's a show about St. Francis of Assisi. So St. Francis is the powerful player in this performance. But what's interesting about thinking of this contemporary performance in the context of powerful players that Claudia was talking about is that in this case, the powerful players are these very banal stuffed animals that you can get at, basically you could go to you could go to across the street to the drugstore and get, stuffed animals, right? They're that banal. And yet, Kati, in her essay, and this is one of the truly confessional ones in the book, she talks about this moment when St. Francis kind of puts all of these very banal stuffed animals, like lines them up on stage. They're not moving, they're not animated, they're just sitting there. But in the context of the performance, she experienced such a profound moment of what she can only describe as grace, and that's the word she uses. And it's very moving to read her reenactment of sitting. It was at this theater festival in Finland. It was independent theater. This is kind of like a punk rock company. The performance was very bawdy. It was very avant-garde. It was very messy. And then in the midst of all of this punk rock chaos, to have this moment of just quiet, silent contemplation with these stuffed animals that you can literally buy at a convenience store. It's very powerful. It's a very powerful essay.
Yeah. And she was somebody who was really, when she wrote to us, she was like, thank you for doing these books because I haven't had a context to be able to talk about this. Yeah. And I really want us to find a way to talk. Yeah. My little shout out is, I didn't know you were going to mention everybody, to Rahul and Sangeet Sankar and Exploring the Spirituality in Tolvavakutu, which is an interview with Rahul's father. And it was really nice to, what are the questions that, we really want to ask, and find out more about, and to hear from him and his background. And I put up the other ones. You can see something from Annie Rollins, who also did an exhibit here a number of years ago on Chinese shadow puppets.
And in the second book, we've also got When the House is in Ruins, Tadeusz Kantor's Archive as Reliquy and Tabernacle for Cross-Temporal Performing Objects by Jacob Juntunin, which is about Kantor's museum in Krakow. And then we also have an essay on Puppets and the Good News by Edna M. Bland. And Edna talks about using Muppet-style puppetry as a form of evangelical Christianity and spreading the news about Jesus to folks.
And she also has some very moving moments she talks about in there as well. So section 4, we have 5 sections, each sort of go moving along, is doctrinal dialogue. So this is looking at performances, because there's a lot of religions and traditions that don't allow the representation of spirits through objects, or there's something problematic about that, about human beings giving things life, because that's what gods do. And so we were looking at that, and how does performance of puppetry or puppet-like things happen in those contexts? So this article, Islam, Animism, and Animation of Objects, Growth and Restrictions of Puppetry Under the Shadow of Religion, is the most historical that we have, a kind of analysis of thinking about Islam and how in certain Islamic countries and contexts, shadow puppetry in particular became such an important tradition. So,
and she's particularly looking at Shiite Islam.
Shiite Islam. Yeah. And so the authors, they take us through, first of all, how within sort of Shiite areas there were pre-Islamic forms of animism, and how that actually set up this kind of conflict when Islam came in, that it had to be anti-animist. So how does animism then reappear? It reappears partly in sacred objects that can take on this force, and so there's this sense of importance to objects that become almost embodied with a kind of sense of the God's presence. And she also talks about these processions, which is what you see here is a procession from Tazieh, processions of mourning, as well as this Tazieh performance that allowed certain kinds of performativity, so that there are performance contexts to draw on. And then shadow puppetry in particular became very useful because it was not considered an object. What you were seeing was an image, and an image that had a kind of metaphysical expression. And so that was a way that kind of art was allowed. But they also propose this important idea from Mullah Sadra, who was a philosopher of the 16th, 17th century, who proposed this idea that the essence of objects was that they were constantly changing and evolving, that was something about objects and materiality. So you didn't have to have a soul in an object for it to be moving, and that this was a very important philosophical idea that also allowed for the acceptance of shadow puppetry.
The quantum field. In section 4 of the second book, we called that Staging the Other World. So we collected essays that were about theater artists who were trying to stage non-material reality. And the example that we want to talk about tonight is Bardot, by performers Sans Fronteras, a reflection on immateriality in shadow theater, Gilson Moraes Mota. So he's both the artist, he's also the scholar. So he's really looking at this idea of, so Bardot in Tibetan Buddhism is the in-between space. When you are transitioning from our three-dimensional reality to whatever is outside of this, you go through what's known as the Bardo, and it's sort of the void. But Bardo in Italian, Spanish also means bard, and in Portuguese. So he is riffing on this idea of that there's this immaterial reality, and we can draw from that immaterial reality and bring things into our world, right? And that shadows are the premier example of this, because in shadow theater you can dematerialize things, borders get blurry, and so for him that represents this alternative reality that's not our three-dimensional earth plane.
My little shout out here, you can see both of these, but is to Michelle Oing's wonderful article, Performing Death, a Medieval Puppet of Christ, which is about these medieval jointed Christ figures. And when you weren't supposed to represent Christ in this way, and it wouldn't be a puppet, but it has movement to it. And actually she talks very much about the way in which people could experience that moment of Christ coming down off the cross and his death through this object that also doesn't look real. I mean, doesn't look like a human, like a real person, and so that distance allows it also to be have this performative possibility within that religious context.
And then in the second book, we have a chapter, the other chapters, Yorai and Puppetry in Japanese Ghost Stories, Misperception and Ambiguous Bodies in Kwaidan by Laura Purcell Gates. If you notice, actually this female figure, that's actually not a puppet, that's actually a person. So one of her case studies, so she's looking at the Singaporean company where they brought in Japanese puppeteers, and they actually puppeteered the puppeteers. So there was this, what's a puppet, what's a person, all of these ontological categories got really troubled by this staging.
So now we're at our final section, Holding Heritage. And within the first book, these are things that maybe I think of like going, how far can we go? You know, moving us further away from the sense of a kind of traditional idea of a figurative puppet. I'm going to talk about forging material connection to the divine, the life cycle rituals of the Sefer Torah. So Torah is not a puppet. But what we have is a very wonderful article by Joseph Mayblum, taking a kind of performance studies approach to thinking about the performativity of and the materiality and performativity of the object, the Torah, and how, first of all, it's made out of very sacred material, is made out of a kind of leather that has to be from a kosher animal. It kind of partakes from ideas of kashrut. There are rituals that the scribe has to do as they're writing, like every time they are going to write the name of God, they have to say, I'm going to write the name of God. And as they write it down, it imbues it with a certain kind of sacredness and power. So this material becomes something more that transcends its sense of object. And then he talks about the way which it's used, the way it's married to the community when it's brought to the synagogue under a huppah, the kind of actions that are taken in services where it's paraded around, people kiss it, but it also becomes an object that allows people to reenact sort of the giving of the commandments. And so there's a kind of memory and sense of connection to genealogy and history that's in this object. And then the object is buried, and people come from the congregation when it's no longer used, and they wail and they cry. So it has this kind of performative aspect to it, and it becomes a tangible. The burial, he says, is a tangible relationship of the assembled, and it's a celebration of that relationship between the assembled and the object. And the congregation transfer their devotion from the elusive figure of God to something material. So it's a kind of analogy that allows you to understand what it means to be connected to something that is immaterial and very difficult to understand. My little shout out is just to the other article in this section, which is called The Enchanted Kavod, Hierophany in Motion by Nina Sabnani. These wonderful objects. You saw earlier an image when I said that they were living traditions, people sitting around with this box that was very colorful in India, and it's a box that's carried to the desert regions of Rajasthan as a kind of traveling altar, and performers open it up and tell the stories that are written on it. So it's a written it's kind of picture storytelling object, but it also is something that carries genealogy. Those performers also have to know the genealogy of the families that they visit, and they're sometimes written into that object. So that's another model of an object that is performative, that is about genealogy and history and that connection.
And then last but not least, in volume 2, our final section is complex sacrality in the contemporary world. And unlike the sublimeness of the Torah, we are dealing with meat puppets, Death, the Body, and the Museum by the wonderful Margaret Wary. Who in here has seen any of the Body Worlds exhibits? Anybody have seen? Yes. What is your big takeaway from the Body Worlds exhibit? One word. It's all right. Okay. Well, Margaret is arguing in her chapter that, so the gentleman, the German artist, for lack of a better word, who came up with the body world's concept is a gentleman by the name of Gunther von Hagens. And he developed this technique for preserving corpses. So, like the Torah, these objects were originally a living being. They were a person who for some reason signed over their mortal remains to body worlds to be allowed to be what they call plastinated. It is a patented process that Mr. von Hagens or Herr von Hagens developed that basically turns your body into a plastic substitute. And Margaret's very provocative argument is that he's presenting these exhibits as educational, right? Come and see how the circulatory system works in the human body. But he is taking these corpses and he is arranging them in these, as you can see from Birdman right here, in these over-the-top, exuberant, almost manic mise-en-scène, which are it's completely not necessary. So her argument is that he's an anti-puppet artist. So even though these are not animated figures, he bakes in this sense of animation into how he mounts them and displays them. It is the most successful traveling exhibit in the history of the world, by the way.
But also there's something about the materials that are human bodies that still seem to speak of their spirits. Like, is there a spirit there? How do we react to these humans?
Yeah, she uses this really great phrase. She calls it the Cartesian cut. That something in these objects, it's leaking out this deeper spirituality, despite von Hagens insisting that these are just pedagogical displays. And on that note, we say thank you.
Oh, there's one more if you want.
Well, gosh.
It's a lot, right?
It's a lot. It's a lot. We
That's
go back to
really-
them. I keep going back to reading the artists against, and each one is so rich.
Yeah.
I mean, we have. I think we're both really grateful also that we had not only such a response, but that the authors were so trusting to give us all this work, and it was a long process and a lot of revisions, and everybody kind of came along through the whole thing. So.
What we want to get to your questions and comments, and I thought of a lot of things listening to your amazing presentation, and I think, when one gets interested in puppetry, as one does, or some of us do, and look into the history of puppetry, you're often looking at, from a Western context perspective, like non-Western, Asian and African performance and Native American performance, and especially studies that are looking at it, those forms from anthropological perspectives, and you realize in all of those cases, the historical cases, as you suggested, you're looking at ritual performance and religion, and that's very different from the way that we've often been taught, like in the United States or other places in the West, to think of performance and entertainment and puppetry as a sort of secular entertainment form, especially for children, and then you run into all this intense ritual. So and now it seems like part of what you're saying is that spirituality, if you will, is actually not distinct from the West. I think of a couple of things. Well, one thing I noticed, and I don't know if this is confusing for anybody in the audience, a wide range of the idea of puppet, some traditional aspects of puppet, but then, the cutout paper pieces, or the sort of pine branch that moves ritually. This is an expansive definition of puppets and these other objects, material objects that move. I think of you were talking about personal things. That my father-in-law Jack Cohen from New Haven, when he died, from the not being a Jew, not being Jewish, he, as a person from the Cohen family, that's considered to be a sort of priestly family. So when he died, when we buried him, and he was pretty agnostic, but a local shul had books of, I don't know if it was the Torah, but religious books, and they tossed those into the grave because, like you were saying about the Torah scrolls, they needed to be buried. You couldn't just throw them away. And so,
Well, and they have to be buried with a Torah scholar.
Yeah, and I think because he was a Cohen, that fit the bill.
Oh, got it. That's right. Yeah.
So there's that, which of course is intensely personal and sort of interesting and fascinating. I think also of, I was thinking, we were talking about magic and puppetry, and when you notice in the history of 19th century American puppetry and European puppetry, a lot of puppeteers were also magicians, right? So this idea of magic and puppetry, also ventriloquism, we have worked from people from the States from the late 19th and early 20th centuries who were puppeteers, ventriloquists, and magicians. And there's something about the manipulation of objects in magic and puppetry that goes together. So I thought that was cool. And then I appreciated your thinking about, the religious puppetry and Christian puppetry. I remember at a time when I was helping make exhibitions in Lincoln Center for the Henson festivals in New York. I had a discussion. I thought, well, let's include Christian puppetry. That's a whole area of puppetry that's very important. And the person I talked to was an established puppeteer. They said, well, is that really puppetry? Because the fact that it was connected to religious ideas or practices meant that it was outside of the realm of puppetry, and that was interesting to me because, knowing that puppetry and religion are deeply connected in other cultures, it was sort of this mark of secular modernity and the idea that puppets are not connected to religion. And finally, maybe thinking of your mention of putting the eyes on the puppets as the last thing. There's I don't think there are apocryphal stories, but stories about Jim Henson's work with the Muppets, and they'd say, well, the very last thing you do when you would create a Muppet would be to attach the eyes. And I don't know this is apocryphal, but oftentimes Jim Henson himself would be called in to figure out exactly where the eyes go, because that's, that completed the puppet. And, I think of the Henson's work as not really being defined as spiritual, although like Jane Henson was very spiritual. But then something like that, it's like, that's interesting.
Yeah.
These little rituals that we do with puppets. I mean, the theater world in general loves ritual.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
And
Totally.
it's the way these things sort of creep
Yeah.
back in, or they don't creep, they march back in. So those are some of my thoughts. Yes?
I was just going to say that it was interesting, again, for me, like you say, we have such an expansive set of articles here, but how people who, a few of these we asked for or curated, but mostly people sent things in, and how they saw themselves and their work, related to this topic. That exactly like you're talking about, the Henson, maybe there could have, and Edna's piece also talks very much about her relationship with Carol Spinney and things that happened in her life that were spiritual to her on her journey to using Muppets and figuring out, what they could do, Muppet-style characters. So it's like it's sort of people find a reflection of this in their own experiences.
Excuse me, we should go to questions or comments if there are any from the audience and from online. Are there any online comments? Yes. Emily, thank you, Emily, very much.
Okay. So, there's interesting conversations happening too. John, your question about what is a puppet was coming up from a couple people. Dr. Lorraine Linkhauer mentioned the variety of cultural representation and puppetry styles are wonderfully rich and diverse. Do either of you think the performance of the spirituality of the other or puppet may represent a deeper need of humanity to create a relatable platform or community for sharing? Perhaps the puppet as a breathing avatar.
Wow, that's a big question. I don't know the answer to that question. I guess here, I'm going to answer it this way, which is, so at the beginning of our talk, we talked about all these things that are going on in our lives and in the world today, this moment where religion is so at stake and at issue in politics and in other things, and that it feels like puppetry, in its broad sense, yes, we take a very broad view of puppetry, objects, performing objects here. Some things, the Torah is not a puppet, but how do we see these connections? But that it's worth looking to puppetry and objects and these kinds of performances to think about another way of thinking about religion and thinking cross-culturally about that. So I don't know specifically about having to play the other. I think that's a kind of different question that I'm not prepared to answer, but I think this needing to at least investigate these situations and what puppetry can offer to the kinds of discussions that are happening, that are about about religion in different ways. Like maybe it would give some other offer other avenues into those discussions and situations.
Yeah, I mean, I would hope that if you can develop empathy for that red chair there, right? I'm going to animate that red chair and make you fall in love with that red chair. I'm hoping that if I can do that with that chair, I can do that with an actual other human beings and show you that that person who doesn't look like you or doesn't have the religion that you have or doesn't speak the language that you speak or doesn't fall in love with the same people that you fall in love with or whatever the difference is, that if we can create empathy for objects, then we should be able to do that for people.
Yeah, I think empathy is a big.
Are there questions in the house here in real life? Yes, over here. We have a microphone for you because we're in the modern world.
Okay, so there's a couple asterisks on this question. The first one is that this doesn't relate directly to everything that we've been talking about. So if you're like, this is a different forum, that's fine. And you can't answer it, that's okay. And then also, I don't know the exact definition of immaterial. But to me, that's like anything that's not physical. And I was thinking about like emotional connections with objects, because I had felt in these first, this is my first semester here, doing some performances, and once it ends and I'm never going to do it again, I feel this sense of loss, and this loss of that puppet, and that, I'm not going to be able to do that performance or be with that puppet again. And I was wondering if that, as scholars, like, is that something that puppeteers talk about, or, have written essays about or something?
That's a really good question. I don't know that there are particular essays in writing about emotions, but I think that's a really wonderful area to explore. And I think one of the things we're kind of saying is that a lot of this work that's spiritual in different ways is drawing on that emotion that you get with objects. Like, so this connection that you can have with an object that is hard to have with something that is immaterial, that you don't know what it is, or, and so objects are mediating those relationships in a lot of contexts.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting question, because I'm thinking in the first book, since we're not dealing with performances in the way that a Western commercial theater thinks about performances, right? So these are ritual objects that maybe get used every year, right? So it's like that puppet's going to be put away because its ritual function is no longer activated, but that puppet's going to come back. But what your question also makes me think of, especially in the first book, are all of the, because we really didn't go into this a lot, but that how the puppets are stored, where they're kept, the amount of care that goes into maintaining these objects, because they are seen, if they're not actual vessels for the god or the spirit, they're right next to the god or the spirit, so they have to be taken care of.
I think, in my own experience, I think of being in a theater company where we using, for example, a lot of masks, and you would say, well, I do this character, that's my mask, I have friends who have a connection to a particular mask that they've been doing for like 20 or 30 years, and like, that's their mask. So they have a very deep connection to that mask, or it could be a puppet, and if someone else does it, you're sort of, well, I don't know. And sometimes as a puppeteer, like, I've been asked, I say I'm a puppeteer, and they say, oh, what's your puppet? As if I only want a puppeteer, but it's only one puppet. But we do, like with the Muppets, you associate, Henson with certain characters, and Frank Oz with others, and, their personalities are deeply connected to puppets. Other questions? Yes, Matthew Cohen in the back.
Thanks, Emily. Claudia, Tim, congratulations on the second volume. It's an impressive accomplishment, a landmark, really. An anthology is only as good as its components, and it's only as comprehensive as what people submit. My question is, what would you have liked to have included in these two volumes and didn't get to because of the submissions which you received? What areas of spirituality and puppetry do you think are not in the volume, and where do you think things might go?
Mainland indigenous North American. When we have Ali'i, so we have Polynesian culture, but we were not able to get someone from this continent's indigenous population. I still regret that. I'm still beating myself up over that.
And that was something we actually spent some time trying to
Yeah,
really track
yeah.
down. Like a lot of this was just stuff that came in, and then we really felt like that was something we wanted to include. But we were very happy when we connected with Auli'i.
Yeah.
Kind of happened towards the end, actually.
And we do have Hazel's chapter about Jonathan Coons in Ohio, right? So we're bringing in the figure of the indigenous person, right? But it's being filtered through this kind of messed up 19th century spiritualist lens, right?
Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Yes, a question. Oh, no, go ahead, Min.
Yes, I also want to thank Tim and Claudia for working with me. Was literally life-changing experience for me. Yeah, and then it's because we talked about quantum physics, so I was I was deeply influenced is Karen Barra, the agential realism about that is a queer theory based on quantum physics that I don't think I can go full length about it, but the main idea about this is about she talks about light. So light at the is sometimes behave like particles and sometimes behave like wave, and then it's both. It's both. It's not one or the other. It's both, but it depending on it is called the apparatus. It's in context. So, is it what I'd like to kind of say is that division between material. There is a material is here, and then there's that immaterial spirit is here. Might be in a way that is to divide the way of looking at it. Whereas it can be embodied in one thing that actually in both ways, but depending on how you set and how you set its context. This is something kind of somehow I got to think about because you kind of opened it with the quantum physics today. Myself also, after writing this, I kind of got myself into shamanic training now. So it's because of all this experience with you, and then that was in way very I don't know what. Well, I will report back to you that where should I thank for it or not. Thank you very much. Yeah,
we should compare notes, man. Well, actually, to that point, I'm glad you said that because I meant to mention this, and as we're moving the microphone over, I'll kill time. In a lot of the New Age folks that I follow, I'm a big New Age person, by the way. I just read something yesterday where it's like actually materiality and spirit are not. They're just it's all just different vibrations of the same energy. You can just see me right now because my atoms are vibrating at a low enough frequency that you can experience me. If everything would start vibrating at a higher frequency, I would disappear, right? I would vanish. So
I wanted to say something too because this was a long process. It was like 4 years.
4 years from start to finish.
And a lot of it took place during the COVID situation. And as I said, we got some, things that were very confessional. And I think it was a lot of people were on journeys. There's something else. So it was itself a process of you're creating something which is going to be an object, but there's a whole kind of spiritual path that's happening along with that process. So we're glad to.
Which is why that little moment with Teresa Linehan at the awards ceremony felt very satisfying. It felt like a manifestation of that, right? You had a question.
You mentioned that Islamic shadow puppeteers were suppressed or something because of the conflict with religious ideas.
Well, it was more like puppetry in general and different kinds of performance under Islam in a lot of places. That there's not you don't want to represent human figures because that's what God does. God creates life, and so there was a kind of critique of that. But it's more like shadow puppetry was allowed. And partly because it's not really a concrete image, it's more like a reflection and a projection and also, at least in Shiite areas, this theory, this philosophical idea about objects having motion also seemed to have helped that to have happen. Is that?
Yeah, I was wondering if there were like other cases of like animism and puppetry or like performance like conflicting with religion.
Yeah, a lot.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
I mean, Catholicism. So that's why we were just looking at the jointed Christ figures, because you weren't supposed to do like performances.
Yeah.
Well, actually, that's not true. In medieval, there's a lot of performances with Christ, but there's a lot of.
You just couldn't believe that it really was Christ.
Yeah.
That's where you had to be. Where the people doing these performances had to be really careful. And so Michelle Owen, in her chapter, one of the things that she's theorizing is that when you look at this figure, it's not mimetic. You're never gonna think that's a real person, right? You're gonna know, there's a part of you that's gonna know that's a sculpture, that's a performing object, that's wood. You're not gonna get confused and actually think that's really God.
Yeah.
And that's what they were worried about.
Because you're not supposed to be. It's not supposed to be idol worship.
Yeah.
That's the problem. The issue with idols.
And there's a famous story that Michel talks about, and also Camille Copagna, who a Polish scholar, did a study of these Christ figures, of the rood of an English Christ figure, the Holy Rood, and during under Protestantism, Protestantism was especially not interested in the figures, and the figure was destroyed by people who were like, no, you cannot do this. You cannot create such figures, because I think for the reasons that Tim mentioned, and if you look at the Protestant church at the corner at the entrance to Yukon, if you go into that church, it's not full of paintings and statues. It's a beautiful space. It's white walls. But there aren't representations of the stories from the Bible and the saints and this and that, or bones and relics of saints captured in there. So there's Protestantism and Catholicism had very big differences of opinion about representation.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of different, religious ideas in different religions about, is an object a conduit for a spirit? Is it the incarnation of something? Like, what is that relationship then that you're defining between whatever that spirit is that's, that is divine, and some object, whether it's a ritual object or something more like a puppet that's used in that way, with this divine thing? Is it just telling a story, or is it embodying some kind of spirit? Is it a conduit? Are you mistaking the object for the divine? So these are the complexities.
Yeah, and I think that we also, I think specifically the chapter in the Torah in particular, I know that we were both a little apprehensive about putting it in the book because we were afraid, Judaism being a religion where there were very strict rules around representation and what can be represented, especially when you deal with ritual, right? And so we didn't want anyone to be offended that we were making a claim that this sacred text, like the most sacred, this object that's also the sacred text, right? So it's both dogma and cultus at the same time together, right? Like in the same thing. We didn't want anyone to think we were insulting the religion or insulting that object by calling it a puppet, by making it sound like it's Punch and Judy or Kermit the Frog, which is unfortunately where a lot of people are going to go in their minds. So so I think you kind of get it. I think there's, as we said, a lot of people want to talk about this stuff. A lot of people want to theorize about this stuff. But it becomes this very charged question about where can I do this in a space where I feel like I can have these conversations and not get attacked or belittled or mocked for doing it, or get into trouble with my own religious, community.
Do we have any more online questions?
Not a question, but our friend Nancy Staub, she pointed out there is a sub-Saharan ritual in which corpses are manipulated, cited in a book by Olenka Darkowski.
Wow.
Yeah, there's a lot of tradition. I mean, obviously, we're just giving any of the like a book like this it's not meant to be comprehensive, certainly in any way. It's here's some models of how we can start to have this conversation and discuss things, and there's a place you can go to. So when you're looking at that tradition, now it's not that there hasn't been writing on these things, but we're putting a lot of different traditions all together into a kind of conversation to sort of map a field. Like, here's a field of kind of discussions in these areas and examples with particularities, and find your examples in here. And are they the examples that are all the way at the far end of things like the meat puppets, or something that is outside of what you might talk about as puppetry like the Torah, but somehow there's this echo of how we're using an object and thinking about its sacredness and thinking about its materiality and how it's relating to people in the space, moving through space and connecting, so it gives a kind of, like mapping out a landscape of discussion.
So,
Yes.
Yeah, thanks Claudia and Tim for putting these wonderful 2 books. So I can see the two established connections, like first in the living traditions in the volume 1 and the volume 2, which talks more about the contemporary and all those stuff. And thinking ahead of time, and in this present time, in this artificial intelligence and automations world, can we expect a kind of the term spirit can be embodied or attributed to such future performances, or will the term spirit will be redefined in the futuristic performances, or in the future if some contributions come? How do you try to accommodate into the term of spirit?
That's a really great question. I would say, actually, it reminds me that the one other thing that we really hoped, I was hoping we would get an article about, are these robots in Japan that are monks that say prayers, in the world of AI. But maybe you want to take this one, Tim. This sounds more like your world.
Could you ask the question again, please? Sorry.
I was just thinking ahead of time, maybe in the futuristic performances, we are just trying, as you mentioned, the example of a chair, how we can embody a character to life. This same, if in the future performances of automation, can we attribute or embody the term or the terminology of spirit into that performance, or we should redefine the term?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. You know what? I'm going to say no. I'm going to say no. I mean, okay. So, I was helping a friend this summer with her mom, and I was talking to her. Her husband's very into AI, and Dan's kind of a character. He likes to tease me, and so we played a game one night, fake Tim Cusack, right? And so I published this article about Susan Sontag a few years ago in an anthology, and we took my essay on Sontag, and we kept asking the AI to come up with chocolate fondue recipes in the voice of Tim Cusack writing about Susan Sontag. And now, it was pretty good, it was fun, but I knew it wasn't me. I knew I hadn't written a word of that stuff. I wasn't there. It sounded like me. It even used words that I would use, but it wasn't me. And I think that's, no matter how much technologically advanced you get, like when I went to see Life of Pi on Broadway, which was a Broadway production, Broadway budget, spectacular. It was watching the humans manipulate the puppets on stage that was the most fascinating for me. I don't care how expensive the lights were or how sophisticated the sound system was and all the sophisticated stuff that was happening. For me, what was the most compelling about that performance was still the guy manipulating the puppet with his hands.
I think this sort of puts us in a kind of philosophical area that is about how we think and, you know, how we think about AI and what the future of that is and what this, yeah.
I think we're
Above my pay grade.
we're pretty much at the end of our presentation. I really appreciate this. I was thinking about the exhibit in our lobby, The World of Puppetry, and when you look at it, the left side is all Asian and African puppetry and sort of puppetry from the Americas, a lot, some indigenous Brazilian puppetry. And then on the right side, it's 20th century United States puppetry. And the stuff on the left is all, when you give a tour of it, like we do, you know, it's connected with the Ramayana or Indonesian versions of that, or with ritual and spirituality. And then when you get to the modern American stuff, it's very apparently secular, right?
Yeah.
And
commercial.
And commercial and
Yeah.
focused on entertainment and the art of theater. And then tonight, I feel like what we're looking at is saying, well, it's actually the spirituality of these things is not limited to tradition and you know, Africa, Asia, and Native American performance, but it's also in the right side of the puppet world, the Western world as well. So I thank you very much for this really exciting presentation with such richness, and thank everybody in the audience here in person and on the interwebs. And we hope you'll come to the next one in November. So thank you,
Thank you.
Claudia, and thank you, Tim. Thank you all for coming.